Hello everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am doing my spring book reading wrap-up, which is really my Beachy and British thrillers wrap-up because I realized all of the books I read in like the last 6 weeks have a theme. They're either set at the beach, or they're British, or both. These are all adult thrillers, didn't have any YA this time around, but I did have one DNF, which is huge for me. I never DNF books, and a part of me wants to go back and give it another shot, but we're gonna talk about the book and kind of expectations versus when a book doesn't deliver on those expectations of what I feel the importance of accurate covers and blurbs are, but I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm gonna go through these in the order in which I read them. So starting with The Rumor by Leslie Cara, this is going to be coming out in the United States in August of this year, but it was previously published in the UK. So this one was interesting. This is both British and Beachy, though it's technically only British in terms of the author who wrote it. It is set in the US, however. I definitely had feelings about this book. I gave it a solid 4 stars because once I hit like the midpoint, the book actually went in some directions I wasn't expecting. And is a great example of a third act that really lands. But I have to say, up until about the midpoint, it was definitely a slower read for me. I found it easy enough to put it down, and in fact, there was a gap of 2 or 3 weeks between starting the book and getting back into the book, and then I finished it in a day or two once I got back into it. But it was definitely one that I was able to put down. And there was one thing about it that really annoyed me, and that was that it was super obvious as I was reading that the author was British. And it was super obvious because there was a ton of Britishisms that were left in the narrative, that bled through the narrative. It's set in the US, yet they would say things like, put the kettle on and pop out to the store. Things that are just very clear Britishisms that an American would just never say. And it wasn't one character talking like this, all the characters talked like this, and it felt like a little seaside British village. It felt very British, and so I did some Googling. I think I hit like put on the kettle, and I was like, I have to look at this author. And that's when I saw, yes, she's British, and it had been previously published in the UK. And one specific thing that really tripped me up, this was later on in the book once I was reinvested in it, and I was enjoying that third act, but I just realized I haven't told you what it's about. Long story short, it's about a woman who lives in kind of a swanky seaside town in Massachusetts, allegedly, but probably really Britain, and she hears one night at book club that an infamous child murderer, like a child who killed a child back in like the 50s or 60s, lives in their town. You know, she's changed her name, and so no one knows who she is now, but the rumor is that she lives in their town now. And she's trying to ingratiate herself with like the other PTA moms, the rich moms, because she doesn't quite fit in. She's a single mom who moved from the city a year or so ago to raise her son in the town. And so in order to fit in with the moms, she repeats the rumor at the school pickup line to seem like cool and fit in, have something to offer. And it takes off and gets out of control really fast. And so there's this one thing that happens later on in the novel. It's a reference, and it just really threw me. So the character in the book is supposed to be my age. She's actually supposed to be younger than I am, and it's supposed to be set now, I guess. And she is talking with her partner, her boyfriend, and he's a journalist, and they're talking about an instance where an artist did this portrait of a child murderer and the fuss that it kicked up. And they were talking about how they remembered this from when they were teenagers. This was a big deal and reminds them of this case. And I'm like, what the hell are they talking about? So I looked up this painting and the person, and it turned out it was real. It was from 1995. The child murderer and the artist in the painting were British. Remember, this character is supposed to be my age. I was 12 in 1995. This was also the halcyon days before the internet and the phenomenon of international media being national media. We lived in a very different bubble in terms of things, and I had never heard of this thing. And I was a super morbid kid. I loved serial killers and true crime. One of my favorite movies in 1995 was the movie Copycat, and I had never heard of this child murderer or this piece of art. And it was just such a clear example of an author who doesn't live in a place, who isn't from a place, who puts their own experience into a book. First of all, I'm like, well, the author clearly is older than the characters because the author clearly remembers this from when they were a teen, most likely, but is not realizing their character was 12 in 1995 at best, more like 11, because I think the character is a year or two younger than I am, 10, 11. And this thing that you put in your book kicked this millennial straight out of the reading experience, because I was like, no, I've never heard of this, and I am an American from the region that this character is supposed to live from, and I'm her age, and it really kicked me out of the book, and I'm just talking about this because it bothered me. I still really enjoyed the book, really liked the third act. Solid read. I genuinely recommend it, but for me, a perfect example of why couldn't the book just be set in the UK? I would have read it set in the UK. I would have really enjoyed it set in the UK. To me, it's just an example of really pushing things too far to try to make it work for an American audience by making all of the characters American, but not changing any of their speech patterns or their points of reference. It was the one thing I didn't like about the book that really threw me off. I kind of want to get my hands on the UK edition. I'm really curious if it was set in the UK. I would love to read that version of the book because it was just that quibble thing where I'm like, it was a little too strained trying to make this an American story. Or it should have been edited so that it fit better, changing some of those colloquialisms in the dialogue and the writing and that reference about the artist and whatnot. I'm like, at least have it be a different explanation, like she looked it up as an adult, not she remembered it as a teen, because I called bullshit on that. So The Rumor by Leslie Cara. I actually liked it. I did give it 4 stars. I do recommend it, but that was the one thing that really bugged me about it. I wish it had been set in the UK, basically. The next book I read is One Night Gone by Tara Laskowski. I believe this is going to be coming out in October of 2019. And this was a really fun, beachy thriller read. And I would actually call it, in a weird way, almost like a YA crossover. Not really, but I think it's an adult thriller read that will appeal to YA thriller fans. If you've ever read a good YA thriller, you might like this because it's told in dual POV. One POV is a 40-year-old divorcee who goes to this beach house in the off-season house sitting to, start over, start fresh, and kind of escape something very embarrassing that happened to her when she found out her husband was cheating on her. It's a fun little thing. And she stumbles upon a 30-year-old mystery of a girl who disappeared. And the other POV is that 17-year-old girl during her last summer in this beach town. It's like wrong side of the tracks. She's lower class. She works for the carnival. She's from out of town. She's a runaway. And she gets mixed up with all of the rich kids in this town. And reading her POV that something terrible is going to happen to her, but you don't know what it is. And essentially, half the book is in this deep POV of this 17-year-old. And one of the things I think that the author did very, very well is the 17-year-old POV chapters of the character named Maureen feel like a YA novel. She feels like a proper teenager. And not just a proper teenager, but a proper teenager in the 80s. Because those portions of when she disappeared are set in 1985. But the bits from the perspective of the 40-year-old divorcee feel perfectly like a 40-year-old divorcee. It felt like those kinds of women's suspense thrillers. So it almost feels like two genres mashed together. And for me, that was a really pleasant reading experience because I'm a YA reader. I liked the juxtaposition of the two different but parallel stories. I found some of the elements of it a little bit predictable, but as with a good thriller, even though I guessed some of the things, I still enjoyed the building tension and reading experience of getting through to the end. This one gave me a bit of a book hangover. I enjoyed it so much that I was looking for a read next that would provide some of the same satisfying feelings. And this is where I stumbled a bit. So we're going to talk about the next 2 books, and I'm going to start with my DNF. Oh, and I gave One Night Gone a solid 5 stars. I really liked it. And that's the thing. I tend to very strategically pick the books that I'm going to spend my time reading because I am a mood reader. I'm not going to pick up a book unless I'm pretty confident it's up my alley and I'm in the mood to read it. But I enter this weird world of NetGalley where it's a matter of requesting books based on a description and a cover, kind of, do I think I'm gonna like this book? And you request and, you know, they let you read certain books. It's different from being able to read the first few pages. They don't always have previews on NetGalley. And so I ended up in a situation where I started reading a book and I loathed it almost from page 1, but I was like, you need to give this book a shot. You liked the blurb, keep reading. But I was so disappointed with what I felt was a bait and switch between the cover, the title, and the blurb, and kind of the author's name as well, which I'll get to in a second. And then the book that I actually started reading, I'm like, I feel lied to and I'm kind of mad about it. So it was The Perfect Wife by J.P. Delaney. This is coming out, I think, in the summer. So it was in the mystery and thriller section of NetGalley. It has a very suspense, like a, you know, women's fiction, adult suspense, both title and cover. It really appeals to me, the cover in particular. And the blurb is, you know, this woman, she's married to this tycoon in Silicon Valley, and she wakes up one day and discovers that she died 5 years ago, but he's brought her back, but she doesn't remember any of the circumstances leading up to her death, but she's been dropped back in her body with her husband and her family and uncovers dark secrets. It's basically an amnesia thriller trope, and I really like the amnesia thriller trope, but with a clear speculative twist. It was clear that, you know, you can't die and come back without there being a sci-fi twist. However, when I actually started reading it, I was like, oh no, this is a sci-fi novel. I like sci-fi, but I wasn't expecting a sci-fi novel based on the cover, the title, and the blurb. The blurb is a classic, like, suspense fiction blurb, but starting to read it, I'm like, yeah, no, this is not what I was expecting, especially following up on One Night Gone. Essentially, I was in a book hangover, and this was just the opposite of what I wanted. But you want to know why, really, this just didn't work for me? 2 things. It's in second person. Second person is a very particular POV, and I think that you really have to be in a mood to read it. It's not used often for a reason, because it can be very awkward, very distancing, it can feel passive. But in this case, I know why the author did it, but that's the thing, like page 2, they're like, she's a robot. I'm like, oh. You know, I knew it was gonna be sci-fi and I knew it was gonna have a speculative twist, but they went full on she's a robot, so this is in second person, and it was just awkward and distancing, and I really didn't like it. Plus, there was an egregious cultural mistake on page 1, and it stopped me in my tracks and made me look up the author, which is when I discovered, so based on the cover and the title and the blurb, I just assumed that the author was a woman. The author's previous titles, it had said like, from the author, blah, 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 and they also sounded like very typical, kind of, you know, the women's suspense genre that I've been reading a lot of. And so they use initials, J.P. Delaney, and I Googled them to see if they were South Asian, because the cultural mistake on page 1, quite egregious, was South Asian culture, and I'm pretty familiar with it through my job, and I even like sent like a line of it. I'm like, this is flat out wrong, right? I sent it to a South Asian friend and she was like, man, is that wrong? Really wrong. And I did send a note through NetGalley to the publisher, like, you really messed this up. You didn't even Google this? It's on page 1. It's a pretty big error. But I Googled the author to see, like, I was like, well, maybe I need to sanity check myself because maybe the author's South Asian and they know what they're doing. No, it's a white guy. White and British guy, which is fine, except seriously do your research, you know, and it's not even about a South Asian person. It's just the first scene is set in India, and they're getting henna done, and it's a whole thing. But, and I was like, oh, do I really want to read a sci-fi novel from the point of view of a female robot written by a dude who made a huge cultural error on page 1. And I know it's a knee-jerk reaction, but it was my knee-jerk reaction as a reader. And then I got like 10 or 15 pages further in, and there was one other line that I just thought was also really culturally insensitive for a completely different reason. I'm not a sensitive snowflake. It just pinged my radar of like, I don't trust this author. I don't know if I want to commit to reading 300, 400 pages in second person by this person. So I DNF'd it. I might go back to it to try again because I feel terrible DNFing a book, especially because I DNF'd it based on my own biases as a reader. But at the same time, I think we do bring biases as a reader to a book. And I was expecting a pretty straightforward domestic suspense novel with a speculative twist written by a woman, and that isn't what this book is. Why did it have to be in second person? Second person, I think that was the final straw for me. I just really don't enjoy reading second person. So I DNF'd the book, but I feel bad about it, and I'm probably gonna try it again because now that I know it's a sci-fi novel with suspense elements, and I like sci-fi with suspense, I might try it again knowing I'm gonna sit down and read a sci-fi novel with suspense elements. So that's kind of where I landed with that. I DNF'd and I feel terrible about it. But also Google. If you're setting something in another place, Google shit, because the error was like laughably bad. It was like common sense bad. My FYI to all of you is that Hindi is a language and that something can't be Hindi patterns because Hindi is a language. Just common sense. So this meant I was left with my book hangover, desperate to read another juicy thriller, and I started to read that and I was thrown for a loop. And so I immediately opened a different book that I had gotten from NetGalley, trying again, and it was A Stranger on the Beach by Michelle Campbell. And I ended up having mixed feelings about this. Again, I gave it a solid 4 stars because of the last third. A thriller for me can really save itself in the last third of the book. I also, as a reader, probably because I'm also a writer, do like to give an author credit for something that's very well executed, even if I don't like the stuff of it. And so the case with this book, so it is about a woman who sees a stranger on the beach. He's this hot young man who's also a bartender in town. She is from New York. She has a very rich husband and they've built this beach house. It's meant to be like the Hamptons, essentially. And they've built this beach house and she throws a housewarming party, and at the housewarming party, her husband shows up with another woman, this Russian woman, and they're having a huge fight, and everyone at the party is like, oh, he's cheating on her, and it's very dramatic and awful. So she finds out in this way that her husband is cheating on her, and she ends up at the bar to drown her sorrows and gets very drunk and picks up the hot bartender who had been the stranger on the beach. They sleep together. And essentially this guy becomes totally obsessed with her and is like, I'll kill your husband for you. And she's like, awkward, no thank you. And basically gets locked into this really intense, dangerous relationship with this dude who's a stalker. Well, that's what we're getting from her first person perspective. You also get third person chapters from his point of view where he's weirdly obsessed with her and kind of like a stalker, but there are slight variations in the 2 points of view, essentially. The book starts out anchored in hers and then starts sprinkling in his, and then it goes into a pretty even split between them. But it builds tension by having her being scared out of her mind because this guy is psycho and obsessed with her. And in his chapters, he is obsessed with her. But there are little details where you start to doubt yourself, where you're like, is he lying or is she lying? And you don't know what to think about it. And here's the thing. I hated every single minute of that. I hated the first half of this book. I think it got to like the 55 to 60% before the narrative switched. The book basically got to the twist. You know, there's always that midpoint twist. And I hate Red. Every single page up to that. And you're like, why did you read it? I told you I try not to DNF things. I do try to give books credit and give them a shot, but mostly I'm so mad at this book. I'm mad but not mad because I got to about the 25% mark. And that's when I realized the discrepancies between the 2 narratives. And I was like, God damn it, I'm interested now, but I hate it. I hate it because I didn't like being in the first person perspective of the rich wife. I found her kind of annoying, you know, entitled and all that jazz. And I didn't like being in the perspective of Aiden, the psycho stalker, because he was acting like a psycho stalker. His POV chapters are really suffocating because he's hyper focusing on this woman. Like, he sleeps with her once and says, I love you. It's just like you get the heebie-jeebies from being in that perspective. I haven't read You yet, but I've heard that that book is similar in the sense that you're in the head of the guy who's obsessed with this woman, and I didn't like being in his head. So I didn't really like either perspective. She's annoying and he's creepy, and I'm bouncing back and forth between these two, but the suspense is building because I'm like, I think one or both of them is lying. I don't think either of them is a reliable narrator, and so I have to keep reading to find out what happens, but I was so mad about it. I was so mad about it. And then the book saved itself in the final third. I can't tell you why because spoilers, but the execution I think does pay off. I gave it 4 stars and I really respect what the writer did with it, but man, I hated both of the main characters basically. I really hated them. I didn't like being with them for the narrative, but then in the last half you get another point of view, and I liked that point of view, and I liked what that point of view added to the story. It had some good twists, some were more guessable than others. It's a pretty solid domestic suspense novel. Oh man, but yeah, I read half of it. But it worked out. It honestly makes me interested to read more of the author's work because I can tell that she's pretty masterful when it comes to craft. She made a deliberate and specific choice with how she told the story, and she did a good job at it. Having such a strong reaction to these characters means she really painted and drew the characters well. I think that dislike can be a really good sign in a book, dislike of a character. So ultimately, I actually liked A Stranger on the Beach by Michelle Campbell, but it was definitely kind of almost like it was an unpleasant reading experience in many ways because I was so tense. I was just tense the entire time I was reading that first half in anticipation of like this guy, and he's obsessed. I'm like, oh, he's gonna kill her husband, but she doesn't want him to. But also, I think she's lying to me. It was ultimately good. But yeah, if you read it too, if you have problems with secondhand embarrassment and feeling so tense about people making poor choices, you might have a similar reaction. I think that was the thing. Like, it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Anyway, ultimately, I did like it. But the book that actually solved my book hangover, because I had those conflicted feelings about A Stranger on the Beach, was Conviction by Denise Mina. So this is my next one, and I loved this book. I flew through it. It was everything I needed after One Night Gone. I just had to find it. But it's a weird book. Oh my gosh, this is such a weird book. So it's British, the British and beach theme, yeah. It's essentially about a woman who, on the morning that she finds out her husband is cheating on her and is leaving her for her best friend, she starts listening to a murder podcast about a fancy yacht that was blown up in the south of France, and the rich family on board all died. And she realizes that she knows one of the people who died on the boat. And the podcast posits that he killed his family, basically. And in order to basically deal with her entire life exploding, she becomes obsessively focused on listening to the podcast while seeking out the truth about this guy that she met, who in some ways felt kind of formative to her, to essentially clear his name as a murderer. But she has her own secret, and she realizes listening to the podcast that there is a figure in the podcast, a character who's a real person, a character in the podcast, but a person who will basically murder her if she finds out that she is still alive. So she basically, in digging into this real murder that happened and trying to clear the name of her friend, she puts herself back into the sights of this individual who basically tried to kill her 10 years ago and forced her to change her identity. You know going in that she is not who everyone thinks she is. She's operating under a false name. And I just really liked the way that everything unfolded. She ends up going on this road trip, this investigation road trip with her best friend's rock star anorexic husband. He's kind of like I imagine him like a Coldplay figure, like the way they describe the band. It's like if Coldplay was a one-hit wonder, that's who that character is. He's like a washed up British rock star, and they go on this road trip around Scotland, and they end up in France and Italy, and it has this kind of overblown soapy caper feel to it, and I really liked it. I wasn't expecting it, and in fact, I almost didn't pick up the book, and I guess that is the lesson of today's wrap-up. Titles and covers are actually really important for pulling readers in. So in the case of The Perfect Wife, I felt duped because the cover, the title, and the blurb weren't what the book is. In this case, I think the title and the cover don't do the book justice, though I also know who the publisher is trying to appeal to. They're clearly going for kind of adult literary readers, not literary, but like adult mainstream fiction readers, like the kind of readers who would have picked up Stieg Larsson's books, which makes sense because the author has done a graphic novel adaptation of Stieg Larsson's books. But when I looked at it on NetGalley, I was like, I don't think this is a book for me. The only reason I ended up requesting it is that the publisher, I really liked the last book I read from this imprint, which was The Stranger Inside by Laura Benedict. And so I was just like, I trust their taste. I'm going to try to read this. And then I loved it. But the cover is clearly like, I'm not the target audience for the book, which was really interesting. But yeah, I really want this to be adapted into a movie. It was this tonally soapy caper. There's this weird section where, so you basically realize partway through the book, this isn't really a spoiler, that the main character is writing a book about what happened, and it's very meta in that way. But essentially, while they're on the road, the rock star starts releasing podcasts. I do have one note for the author about what a podcast actually is. It's basically him recording voice notes and releasing them to Twitter. I'm like, that's not a podcast, but I really admire you trying. But the idea that he is basically releasing these audio files to Twitter as they're on their road trip, which of course endangers their lives even more. But they start like basically becoming virally famous from chasing down, like they're listening to a podcast and recording a podcast, and it's very meta. And there's this really great chapter where they're on a train and they get ass drunk with an assassin, and the book frames it as like, so you all listeners know, like, this is the most popular episode of the podcast, you know, getting drunk with an assassin, but this is what really happened. And it's this just like over the top insane scene with these two different assassins, and they're getting drunk, and she realizes they're contract killers and the rock star doesn't, and it's just this hijinks humor scene that feels both out of place and perfectly in place in this novel, because tonally it's a caper, it's a romp, and I really hope someone options it for film because I think it would be a delightful film. I can see Working Title making something like this, but yeah, 5-star read. I loved it. You know, you also might not gravitate towards the cover naturally because I feel like none of us are the target audience, kind of, you know, typical adult thriller readers, you know, women's suspense, etc., but it's really good. And that's going to be coming out in July. It's Conviction by Denise Mina. Also, I don't love the title. It's a whole thing, but I loved the book. Next, I read The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. Oh, I'm so excited because if you are familiar with me and my feelings on Ruth Ware, I have a whole review of her last book, which was The Death of Mrs. Westaway, where I got into some of my Ruth Ware feelings, and I will link to that down below. My Ruth Ware feelings are, I loved In a Dark, Dark Wood, The Woman in Cabin 10, and then I really didn't like The Lion Game, and I keep meaning to make a video about it because I think it's an excellent test case for writers of how you can have a very good idea, but it's all about nailing your execution. And I felt like for me, the reason I didn't like the book was there was just some execution that didn't serve the mystery and the twist as well as it could have. But then I loved The Death of Mrs. Westaway. It was a 5-star read for me. And The Death of Mrs. Westaway was a gothic thriller. And The Turn of the Key is also a gothic thriller. And I feel like we are in Ruth Ware's gothic thriller period, and I hope she writes more, because as much as The Death of Mrs. Westaway was a 5-star read for me, this is like a 5-star plus read for me. I never adjust my ratings after the fact, but I guess if I had to, that would probably be adjusted down because this was such a solid astronomically fantastic 5-star read for me. Because it combines and nails the two things I love about Ruth Ware books, or the two books I love from Ruth Ware. It has the creepy glass house in the middle of nowhere from In a Dark, Dark Wood, and it mixes it with all the gothic creepiness of The Death of Mrs. Westaway. It's essentially about a nanny who is hired for this super rich family in the middle of nowhere in Scotland, and it's a smart house, and soon after she's hired, the parents basically disappear for 2 weeks, leaving her completely alone with a 9-year-old, I believe, a 5-year-old, and a baby. And creepy stuff starts happening. She starts hearing things, like things start like disappearing and being moved. And she already knows that all the previous nannies before her left under mysterious circumstances and thought the house was haunted. The mom, when she hires her, literally says, I have to let you know that the previous nannies thought the house was haunted, and I need to know up front whether you believe in that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, this is so gothic. And it's basically this escalation of the nanny losing her mind. And you know up front that one of the children died, because it's told in frame where the nanny is in prison. She's been arrested for leading to the death of killing this girl. All 3 kids are girls, so I didn't just spoil for you who died. All the children are girls. And she's writing a letter to a lawyer begging him to represent her and basically saying, like, the public defender who was assigned to me, like, I keep, when I try to tell the story, I keep tripping up and they think I'm crazy because I can't tell the whole story without explaining all of the backstory. So it's her basically writing him a letter that's actually a novel about what happened, begging him to believe her so that he'll represent her and save her life. I'd say at first this device is a little heavy-handed, meaning the book takes a little bit to kind of kick off. So she starts to kind of explain, but then like breaks that fourth wall, so to speak, like addressing the lawyer directly. The first couple chapters is her starting the letter a few times, but then hating what she wrote and starting again. But pretty quickly it becomes seamless where the references to the lawyer drop away and it's really easy to get right into the story. Kind of toward the middle and the third act, she references the lawyer again once or twice, which I actually appreciated, kind of coming back to the frame device, but it's not too heavy-handed and ultimately is very well done. I was engaged, I was guessing, I didn't guess everything, but I guessed some things. It is just like perfectly creepy and gothic. I understood everything the nanny was going through. I alternately loved and hated the kids. Really great job. Very turn of the screw, which I assume is the reference from the title of where the kids can't be evil, but damned if they're not damn annoying because they're acting like kids. Really good building of that kind of emotional suspense. And then I can't say anything about the end because I don't want to spoil a single thing about it, but it totally worked for me. The big finish worked for me. 5-star read. I feel like Ruth Ware has finally really arrived. I like all of her books except for The Lion Game, but I feel like she's just finally really come into her own. I think this book is just perfect. I love how she's continually remixing Agatha Christie novels and tropes and gothic stories and tropes. This feels very a turn of the screw. And the last one felt very Rebecca to me, and I hope she continues to do it. I love how she basically takes these classic things that lovers of genre know, but she comes up with really clever ways to essentially reinvent them for the modern mystery thriller suspense reader. I'm a massive fan. She's an auto buy for me, and I really loved it. And The Turn of the Key comes out in October. Sorry you have to wait so long. They used to come out in the summer and now they're pushing them to the fall. And last but not least, I read Where the Missing Go by Emma Rowley. This is another British one. Should have said Ruth Ware is British, so it's set in the UK. So this one didn't turn out exactly as I expected, and yet is exactly as I should have expected it to be. Very grounded domestic suspense thriller, but specifically, so it's about a mother whose daughter ran away, I believe 3 years ago, and it's very, she disappeared, and everyone's told her to move on because she ran away and she doesn't want to be found, but the main character, the mom, just cannot move on. Her daughter's leaving, her disappearance has ruined her life. She's hyper-focused on this idea that something must have happened to her, and she just needs to stay where she is, and, so that if her daughter needs her, she can reach out to her. She starts working for a helpline that's essentially a call-in line where anyone who has run away can call in to relay messages to their loved one without compromising where they are. And one night she's working and she gets a call from her daughter. And the line is really bad, but her daughter basically says, I'm fine, don't look for me. But the mom can't let it go. She becomes obsessed and essentially goes to the police and is like, you have to trace the call. And this is the thing. I guess I was expecting from the blurb a far more straightforward investigation story. But ultimately, it's a far more passive, character-driven investigation story, but that's not a bad thing. But it essentially means that the pieces of clues and mystery and investigation don't start coming together until much closer to the middle than I would have liked. I would say if I could change one thing, I would have the mom catch wise to certain clues that do drop about what happened to the daughter a little bit earlier in the book to kick off the midpoint twist, which I'm not going to reveal. But just to say that I liked it. I liked where the book shifted in the middle. And from there, it was a very fast-paced read for me, but the first half of the book was a bit slower. I started it and I put it down for a few days. I was fine to not read it for 3 or 4 days, and then it wasn't until I came back to it and got to that midpoint turn that I was compelled to read the rest of it very, very fast. It was a case of reading it on the train to work and not wanting to stop reading when I got to work, which is always a really good sign of a good suspense novel. But ultimately, I gave it 4 stars, knocking off the star just because of the slower reading experience in the beginning. And the thing is, it's really a portrait of grief more than anything else. And there were definitely some uncomfortable moments in the first half because it gets very, very deep into the main character, Kate, and her feelings and her depression. And it feels a little suffocating in the sense that it feels hopeless because until some of the clues start dropping, as I said, they dropped a little later than I would have liked. There's nothing for her to go on, and that's actually realistic in a lot of ways, but as a reader, it's tough being in that headspace. But of course, there are readers who would really enjoy the way that was, looking for kind of more slow, character-driven in the beginning. I will say the slowness in the beginning and really delving deep into her grief, and of course her conviction that something happened to her daughter rather than her daughter willingly running away, it does help build so that when you get to the far more fast-paced third act, it does come together pretty nicely. I do feel that there was a nice payoff of everything, but I also guessed the twist, because there's always the midpoint and then the one at the end. I did guess. But I didn't enjoy it any less for more or less calling all of the kind of little twists. So it was a good read, and this one actually comes out the soonest. It comes out at the end of this month, May 30th. And that's it. That is my spring reading wrap up. These are the books that basically got me through my YA thriller. I started reading thrillers right before I started drafting, and I binge read thrillers all the way through, which is why you've gotten 2 wrap-ups in a row that are all thriller all the time. But I hope you enjoy it. You guys really seemed to like the Recs last time, so I was happy to tell you about these books as well. I just think it's funny that they're all either British or set at the beach, really as a theme. Hopefully the next time I do a reading wrap up, there will be a bit more variety. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I will do more reading and wrap-ups, more booktube-ish content. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy reading.